Okay, so last when we left, we had talked about all of the types of power. And we'd gone through the 5 powers and how we talked about them. And now we're going to talk about the flip side, where we're going to talk about the measuring of power, and we're going to talk about dependence. All right. We actually have something of a measuring stick when we're defining how much power we have, is by defining how much dependence our channel partners have on us. And so we use 2 concepts. One is utility, and the other is scarcity. So how do we define dependence when we're talking about it in these terms? Dependence has 2 things. One of them is that when we have a greater utility, okay, when we have, and by utility, we mean 3 things. We achieve greater value, we have benefits from our particular relationship, and we have satisfaction from it as well. Now, value and satisfaction are 2 totally separate items. We've talked about value and satisfaction marketing for decades. And the greatest way to think about it, in its truest sense in marketing, we're more concerned about value, but satisfaction is second place only by a little bit. Because satisfaction just means whether or not a good or an item meets or exceeds your expectations. It's one of the other reasons why they try to downplay your expectations as well. But for years, we were trying to use satisfaction as a measuring stick, and only satisfaction. And then, of course, you go into Walmart, and you don't go, man, I'm really satisfied with going into Walmart. Walmart traditionally ranks 6th, 7th, or 8th in terms of satisfaction, and yet Walmart makes anywhere from 4 to 5 times the generated revenue of an Amazon. And perhaps the reason isn't that satisfaction, and maybe it's because of value, which is probably the better way of figuring it. So we define dependence by the scarcity, the alternatives, and the utility. Excuse me. And so if we use this funky little equation here, and once again, it's very difficult to put in numbers, but it's always easy or a little bit easier to understand if you see it in an equation. Dependence equals the utility, what we get out of it, the value, the benefits, and the satisfaction, multiplied by the alternative scarcity. Now, the 2 things, if you notice by that, and the reason that they put that multiplication sign there, is that you have to have a derived value for both of them. Otherwise, there's no dependence whatsoever. All right. So what that means is if I get no value, no benefits or satisfaction from this particular relationship, then low utility is basically like multiplying by 0. It doesn't matter how scarce it is, because if we get nothing from it, then we don't derive anything from it. All right. If I get a great value from B, but I have so many other sources that can provide me the same value, B's dependence is still low. And so if you notice, that's why you use the multiplication, is because you have to have both of those things at the same time. So this is one of the difficulties in marketing, and why marketing stresses uniqueness and specialty as well. Because if B can readily find other sources to provide the same value, how does B go about looking for A? What's the number 1 way it will judge if everything is equal among the sources? What's the one thing they're going to use? All things being equal, if you had 2 pieces of equipment that you could buy, yes, price, exactly, very good, yes. Ultimately, this is the one thing that we don't wish to have. It's kind of interesting now, if you think about it, commodities. A commodity is basically one thing that is allegedly exactly like another. If I were to say, somebody give me a banana, somebody give me a banana, name one. Name a banana. Eat a banana. Isn't it amazing you said a brand, not a type? See? Yeah, I mean, and that's exactly the point I wanted you to make. Thanks. See, we would derive the value coming from the brand, but not necessarily the type. Interestingly enough, by the way, the banana is known as a Cavendish. The banana that we all eat is a Cavendish. So that's, and I think it's something like 40% of all the bananas in the world are Cavendishes, all right? But there's something like 50 to 60 different species of bananas. But we tend to think of the banana by the brand. And this is one of the important things that marketing does, even in marketing channels, is that we make each supplier and each individual different and special. And it's the benefits and the value, especially associated with the brand name, that make them so important. So it's important to look at utility and scarcity separate. And so each one of these things means something different. And one of the things that's also kind of important to recognize is that when we look at utility, all right, we're looking at what company brings the greatest utility to you, is that if your partner looks at your goals and finds ways of helping you meet those goals. And so I'm looking over, I'm the director of professional education too. And we have former alum of App State out there who are looking to get licenses to be able to do things with SAS code and those kind of things. And one of the things that it's important for me to do is to go out to those alumni who are looking for this SAS kind of coding. And I want to know what their goals are. Because if I understand what their goals are, I can find some way of helping them achieve that. And so the greater opportunity that a partner has to recognize your goals and do whatever it can, the greater value and thus the greater utility. So it's scarcity, you got to know for a couple of things. Who are the potential competitors of those particular brands? And if alternatives do exist, do you need to determine how easily the channel member can switch? Switching costs, folks, is a big thing. And it's important that you remember that as well. I'm sure I'm not the only individual in here who doesn't switch their phones just because the amount of switching costs it creates in trying to move back and forth. I find it's amazing, especially, I don't have iPhone, I like to use Android, but I'm amazed at how Apple invests itself into probably the most seamless upgrades of their machines I have ever seen. So my daughter, I bought her a new iPad. Yeah, my kids have had iPads since 2, God help me. And anyway, I don't know if you've ever done this before, but the iPads, the way it worked is I took the first one and it said, are you getting an upgrade? And I said, yes. And it says, put the iPads next to each other. And so I did. And all of it says, it starts going, switching now, switching now. And an hour later, I walk back and everything's done. And just in that, I find it impossible to try to switch from one pad to another. I got into a little thing about 5 years ago where I was buying like $20 and $30, $40 tablets just to see how they work. And they actually work pretty good. I mean, when you have Android operating system, they all operate the same. The only real difference, of course, is the quality of the screen, which, you know, iPads are, to me, unmatchable, except for Samsung. And those two either different or unique, but generally the rest are, you know, the same. And so if we were to look at the iPad, especially when it comes to scarcity, it's unmatchable, all right? And that's, if I were to measure dependence, especially if I were looking into the realm of medical equipment or something like that, and I was developing apps for those particular items. It's one of those things I recognize. I'm not an Apple person, but I recognize their unqualified superiority over other brands. All right. And so you look at both of these things together, utility and scarcity, and ultimately what it gives you is this combined analysis. When you do both of them at the same time, it ultimately reveals the dependence of your channel member on another. All right. So all of that saying, and it's very nebulous and very kind of up there. Is there actual things that we can look at, actual numbers that we can look at that can help us define those things? And so if I were looking for those kinds of things, being able to measure it, I think one of the best ways is to look at the percentage of sales or profits that are earned by that particular channel member. And so if I were selling iPads, let's just say that, let's say I was selling used iPads. I had a secondhand store, and I wasn't necessarily an Apple brand, but I was, let's say, a gray market, and we'll talk about gray markets later. And maybe my percentage margin may not be 10% or 6% on an iPad, but if they were 40 to 50% of my sales, that would be a measurement of that particular amount of utility and scarcity, all right? Because it estimates that percentage of sales, and the fact that those aren't easily substitutable also is a way of giving you an idea of how important they are. The next is what's called role performance. Now, every successful partnership has each individual in the partnership performing a role. And we talk about actors and we talk about roles, and those are many things. When you're in a partnership or one way or another, the interaction between each other, we can be many things. We can be a negotiator. We can be a sympathizer. We can be a cheerleader. We can be all of those things. And those are roles that those individual corporations play. And if we also think in terms of traditional logistic versus legal logistic, the willingness to stand beyond the legal logistic and think about in terms of accepted norms and values, our willingness to extend beyond that, those are the roles that we play that are extremely important. Role performance is less important in a rapidly rising market. So if we're in a market, or if we were just on the cusp of let's say, smartphone era, this is an example, I would look at non-fungible tokens and the whole Bitcoin era that we're just starting at the very end right now. Role performance is less important because you have so many focal actors out there being able to perform those roles that they're less important than they should be. Crypto and Coinbase, whichever ones we use, are less important, and they will be more important later. That's all that I want to say. All right. And so if we're looking at power, the mirror image, in other words, the reflection of power is dependence. So you might even want to flip it around and say the reflection of dependence is power. The more dependent you are on that individual in the relationship, the more power that individual has. The best ones, the best relationships are those in which you have a balanced perspective, where there's a balance between the partners. And that a true measure of dependence is when you assess both channel partners. Dependence and interdependence are both two separate thoughts, but they're very important when you're looking at them together, because ultimately Interdependence is the glue that holds it together, all right? You could also say there's a high mutual dependence. There's this thing that the glue that binds, that makes it easier, okay? And the danger, of course, is that in a balanced dependence is good because when there's an asymmetric power, you have the issue of exploitation, all right? Dependence also means that both sides have power. They do. You know, I mean, what a truly balanced dependence means is that there is a countervailing power on both sides, which can self-protect you. But the truth is that in every relationship, or let's just say all relationships are not balanced. How many are more asymmetrical? It's a good question. Many times it just depends on who the players are and who is willing to be balanced. So what happens in an imbalanced dependence? Well, what you can have is one channel member can become much more dependent on the other. And yes, you do suffer the exposure of exploitation. And what you can have is that this exposure can lead to one side losing both economic and non-economic terms. And what will happen is, and the danger of this especially, is that when times are not good, the side that has less dependence will find in one way or another some way of exploiting the dependence that the other side has or needs. So you're a corporation, you're happy, you have, you're a manufacturer, you have individuals below you, you're in times of crisis right now, and how do you react? Well, one of the ways that you react is, let's say you're demanding a higher percentage from the retailers who are selling your product. That would be an example. Or what they would say is, you can't cut your prices, but what you have to do is, instead of taking 15% of that, you can only take 10. In other words, you lower the amount that you allow them to take home. Those are some of the examples of real things that actually happen. Well, what can you do? What are the reasonable alternatives? Well, here's what you can do. So B depends more on A, and A is doing exploitation. Here are some of the things that you can do. The first is that you can develop alternatives to A, and this is the most common thing that you can do. So Mitsubishi, I talk about them sometimes. Mitsubishi, when I was working for Con Appliances in there's a Cons in Gastonia. I thought that was amazing. They originally came out of Texas. So we were selling Mitsubishi televisions. And the problem with that is that New Generation right outside Lafayette city limits was selling Mitsubishis as well, but they had a contract from Mitsubishi of Canada. And so they had a higher margin than we did. So what was happening is because we had some pretty savvy guys and gals, they would come to us, talk to us about the special parts. And then once we sufficiently educated them, they went to New Generation and bought the Mitsubishi TVs for like 10% less. And so we got up in arms. And so one of the things that we did was we went into a service contract with Sony. So this is the 80s. Mitsubishi had Diamond Vision, which was really, really good, especially with live broadcasts. So if you really wanted to show up a Mitsubishi TV, if there was a live football game, you turned it on, all right? By the way, most of the big stadium screens that you see, those are Diamond Vision. They're built by Mitsubishi, okay? Even though they work with, I'm gonna lose, Daktronics, that's it, right. The guns in those things were built by Mitsubishi. Sony had the Trinitron, and their particular technology was pretty darn good. It wasn't quite as good in live broadcasts as Mitsubishi's, but everything else it blew away. And so we started to have this contracting thing with Mitsubishi. And so that was one of the things that we did. The next is you can try to organize a coalition within the individual groups or sellers. So we all are having intra-competition with each other, but we're all having to fight with the big guy upstairs who's trying to do these things to us. A great example is after World War II, GM decided that they wanted to go totally vertical market. And what they did was they were going to slowly phase out the dealer networks, and you're going to buy directly from GM. The Automobile Association got together, formed this coalition, started writing the congressmen because they started telling them, you realize, of course, the tax base in this particular area is going to go to nothing when we're not selling 120 cars a month. Politicians got into it, it all came back to GM corporate, they stopped. And so that's an example of what you can do. You brought they created a third party and they fought against it. The next is that you just get out of it. It's just had enough. You don't no longer seek the business. You may even just get out of the business entirely. So you may say, well, I'm no longer going to buy or sell these particular things, and then it doesn't matter. We decided, this was the other place I worked at in Lafayette, when I was at Omni Computer Store, we decided we no longer wanted to sell Hewlett Packard. They were too expensive anyway, so we started building our own PCs, and we started building white boxes, and I'll talk about that stuff later. Hewlett Packard was a real bad relationship. I'll just put it that way, and I'll talk about relationships when I get into it. So these are the ways, when you have dependence, what you can ultimately try to do. So if you really have, what do you really do? Well, the most common reaction is that you don't react. And you try to trust the other party to take your interests into account. And this is the whole traditional legalistic power kind of thing. You hope that the structures and norms don't allow that individual to, take advantage of you. And the truth is that some imbalanced relationships actually work quite well. It may sound surprising, but there's that old saying, better the devil you know. If this imbalanced relationship is stable and it's predictable, then it gives you some forecast and some reasonable expectation of where you're going to go in the future. And so even though you can't expect a future of better things, it might actually be that this can work out quite well. And so that's kind of an example that sometimes the best reaction is just no reaction. You just go along with it, all right? So both dependence and interdependence, they help to complete the picture. They both have their pros and cons. The motivation is cooperation. And what you hope is that it encourages good relationships. So you have two things. Interdependence encourages the relationships, the need to get together, all right? And hopefully what you can do is, with these specific investments that you have in each other, you can provide for a better future for each other. All right, so I talked about power, and I talked about the uses of power, but how do you actually vocalize power? How do you actually, if you were in a meeting and you were going to try to use one of these powers, how do you go about doing it? Well, the way that you would do it is these are what are known as power influence strategies. And each one of these starts with a certain series of words, and you can look at them and you can reflect which of the powers that each one uses. And so I'm going to first go to this slide and give you an idea of the influence strategies. And I wanted you to see these. I don't know why they're flipped like this, but they are. So let's start with this one. And now we'll go back and we'll talk about each one of these one at a time. So the first one is a promise. If you do what we wish, we will reward you. So you don't have to think very hard and look at that, and that's a reward power. If you do what you want, we'll do what we want, we'll give you a cookie. All right, simple as that. It can be stated, it can be implied, any way you want to use it. You just basically give a reward for the completion of the task, whatever it is. And of course, coercive power, the way that you would express that is through a threat. If you don't do what we wish, we will punish you. And so this is kind of a negative promise, if you want to put it that way. But once again, as I've said, a threat tends to be something that is looked upon as an attack upon you. And so threats have to be done at the last resort. Now, legalistic and request, you could actually say that both of those, in whatever way you wanted to paint them, could either be traditional legalistic power or legal legalistic power. And so legal legitimate, excuse me. So if you do what we wish, you should, because you have agreed to do so. And the fact that this is normative, it says you should do this, this is what's considered traditional legitimate power. It is a request based upon your individual norms. If they would have said, you should do what we wish because it's in the contract, that would be legal legitimate power. It is contractually based. You shouldn't do this because you're violating my patent right. That would be an example. A request could either be it's not a reward power because you're not rewarding them with anything, but it is a traditional legitimate power where you're just saying, please do it. Conform to the norms. We ask this out of respect one way or another. Now, the last two take the most time, but they are the better, long-lasting power-based, spit it out, Dave, power-based influence strategies. These are the ones where you have to invest some time, because one of the things is that both of these require you to invest time in understanding the partner that you're working with. So information exchange. Let's talk about things. Let's get in a general discussion about the most profitable way for you to run your business without mentioning exactly what you want. So let's just get in a conversation. We'll look over the facts. All right, this can be both referent power, because you're saying, hey, out of your respect for me, let's get in a conversation. And then also when you come up with, oh my gosh, going blank, not referent power, but expert power, all right? We know all this information, so let's spell it out. Now, the truth is, with this one, are you fooling anyone? Really? No. I mean, if I'm going to get into discussion about what's the best way to do things, the truth is that the discussion's already been created and you've already got your own idea how to do it. And so an information exchange it's a very thinly veiled persuasion strategy. So rarely does it work. But the recommendation, I believe, is the better one because it puts all your cards out on the table. It's an information exchange. We'll discuss the profitable methods. We'll provide you with the conclusion, which is that you should do what we wish. But let's face it, it's a lot more honest. There's a saying that we have is that people are very poor actors. We think we are very veiled in the way that we say things, but the truth is, unless you're very practiced, it's not easy to lie. We tend to give ourselves away in conversation, And so I'm one of those people that believes far more, let's just throw our cards out on the table. Let's talk this over person to person. And recommendation takes the most amount of information. It takes a lot longer to build up to it. But if you're asking about what strategy, influence strategy works best in the long run, this is the one. These might work best in the short run, but they don't guarantee a long-term success. It's kind of like a sales promotion in a way. You know, the difference between market communication and a sales promotion. The sales promotion wants or has the expectation of making a sale within a given time frame. And so on the short term, it can be successful, but in the long term, what it might ultimately do is damage the relationship in one way or another. And so these are the 6 based influence strategies. You might want to put in your own mind which one connects with which. So like which power connects with which of the influence strategies. But this is how you would verbalize, or this is how you would put into action the powers that you have. Okay. Do they work? Generally, yes, depending on what you're looking for in terms of the short term and the long term. And folks, do not underestimate the power of a request. If you read Cialdini's Influence, okay, so Cialdini did a chapter on influence, and one of the things that he said is, what is the power of just simply asking, please? And so what he did was he set up this, well, actually it wasn't Cialdini, it was Stanley Milgram, who's a brilliant psychologist. So what he did was he had somebody, it was a normal office setting, and they had people with, using the copiers. And what they said was somebody would come up and say, may I please make my copy ahead of you? That's all they did. And if somebody asked why, they would just say, I just need to make these copies. Overwhelmingly, almost 9 out of 10 people would allow someone to go ahead just because they asked. And so you'd just be surprised if you just ask. Sometimes that's all that individuals need. Because generally people work in a wanting matter of wanting to help if they're just asked in the right way. So request is more powerful than you might think. And I would use it, to me personally, I would use it as the last thing you do. Please, please. All right. Okay. Last thing to discuss is, where does power fill in with the omni-channel? So let's face it now, the omni-channel or the use of multiple channels is the norm. There's no way around it. We are in a brave new world in which the omni-channel is used. And here's the thing. The squeeze is the advantages that the suppliers or the manufacturers have. They love it because it increases market penetration. It means that there's not a single place on the globe that they don't have access to. You have a greater view of multiple markets at the same time, and you have the enjoyment of healthy competition. And by that, what I mean is that competition always makes the competitors better. It always does. It's just one of those things. It can be kind of tough when things get short, but the more manufacturers that are out there, the winners, of course, are always going to be the consumers when there are challenges. Now, the consumers like the omni-channel because it gives them the ability to go find things that work best for them. And they can always seek the lowest prices, which, yes, things turn down to price. Now, the difficult part in between here is, of course, the retailers and the wholesalers and the specialized intermediaries, they're the ones that kind of get pinched. But the truth is that the strength of the omni-channel is that it is so overwhelmingly strong that if you're asking me who's the channel captain now, this is not a test question. But I think in the long run, the omni-channel has given enormous power to the consumer. So much power, as a matter of fact, that all of the members have to play ball together. Otherwise, the whole system breaks down. So the very top and the bottom, manufacturers love it, suppliers, consumers like it. And what, in essence, the wholesalers and the retailers must do is they have to find a way of living with that in some way, whatever possible way they can. So what you find is, progressive insurance, okay? I'm not asking you if you have Progressive, but I know, Progressive is a totally online insurance corporation, but I'm not sure that any of you knew that that's a subsidiary of Allstate. Allstate runs Progressive. And why? Quite simply, it's because of this. It's because the pressure from top to bottom on the omni-channel was so great that the difficulty of living in the traditional world in which you have, only retail outlets was the one you simply couldn't live with. Taxmaster, all right. Let's see, H&R Block. Well, H&R Block was one of those that had traditionally local places that they don't anymore. They still do, but you have to work, with independent dealers. But that's another example of those tax groups online, quite simply because of the overwhelming nature. Bottom run, what all of this means is, because if you're asking for what does this mean in terms of a test question, it means this is that the power of the omni-channel was so strong. The power is overwhelmingly on the consumer side, that there is a more or greater need than ever for the intermediaries and the manufacturers to play ball together just for the sake of survival. So what it means is the omni-channel has created a tighter market, a stronger market, and in many ways, it's maybe perhaps a more survivable market, okay? It's a Pax Omnichannelica, whatever you want to call it, instead of a Pax Romana. It basically it's a piece that's been enforced by the strength of the way the channel is today. And so with the use of multiple channels visible now, with so many different ways, all of those channels have to find a way to cooperate, quite simply because the consumers are demanding it, okay? All right, I said I would get out early, we're out early, all right? So that finishes chapter 3. Next week, we'll come in and we'll start talking about relationships. Get very Dr. Philly in this, okay? All righty, you have a good weekend. You bet.
Thanks, Professor.
Have a good one.
Thanks.